At my son's engagement party, his fiancée handed me a laminated card that said, "Observers only know speaking without permission." She laughed and told the room it was just a bit of fun. Nobody said a word. I smiled, put the card in my jacket pocket, and thought about the USB drive sitting in my car. My name is Warren, and I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years working for the New South Wales Roads and Maritime Services, most of it out of the Wollongong depot. My wife, Carol, passed away from ovarian cancer 6 years ago, just before she turned 58. We'd been together since we were 19, met at a beach bonfire at Thirroul. Of all places, her friend knew my cousin. The usual story. Carol was the kind of woman who remembered the names of every tradesman who ever came to our house, who kept notes in the margins of cookbooks, who drove 4 hours to be at a friend's funeral, even when she was going through her own chemo. Our son, Callum, is 31. He has Carol's stubbornness and her laugh, which is both a gift and occasionally exhausting. He works in commercial property in Sydney now, been there about 4 years, doing well by all accounts. After Carol died, Callum and I were close, in the way that grief makes you close. Not always comfortable, sometimes raw, but honest. We'd have Sunday calls. He'd come down to Wollongong for long weekends. We'd walk along the beach at Austinmer, eat fish and chips out of the paper. Talk about nothing and everything. That changed when he met Priya. She came into his life about 2.5 years ago. He called me on a Wednesday night, which was unusual. Our calls were Sunday, and I could hear something different in his voice. Lighter. She'd been at a work function, some property industry thing in the city, and they'd ended up talking for 3 hours by the harbor. He said she was sharp, funny, ambitious. I was glad for him. I genuinely was. He'd had a hard few years after Carol, we both had, and if someone was making him feel like that on a Wednesday night, I was in no position to be anything but happy. I met her for the first time, about 2 months after that call. Callum brought her to Wollongong for a Saturday lunch. She was striking tall, well-dressed, spoke quickly and confidently. She worked in finance, something to do with investment portfolio management. Though whenever I asked questions about it, she'd give answers that were technically responsive but never quite satisfying. I remember thinking she was the kind of person who was very good at seeming to answer questions. Lunch was fine. Not warm exactly, but fine. Callum seemed happy, which was what mattered. I told myself I was just an old bloke from Wollongong who didn't speak the same language as people who worked in Sydney finance. I told myself to give it time. The first sign that something was off came about 3 months later. Callum called one Sunday and mentioned, almost in passing, that Priya thought our Sunday calls were a bit much. Her word, apparently. He said it carefully. The way you say something you know might land badly. I asked what she meant by that. He said she felt like it was hard to make plans on Sundays because I was always on the phone. I pointed out that we talked for 30 minutes, 40 at most, and that he'd never once mentioned it being a problem. He said, "Yeah, I know. But she finds it a bit I don't know. She just thinks adults should have more independence from their parents." I let it go. We moved the calls to Thursday evenings. By the time 6 months had passed, I was calling Callum on Thursday, and he was picking up maybe 1 in 3. The other times he'd text, "Busy, we'll call back." He rarely called back. When I did get him, the conversations were shorter. He'd started using phrases I didn't recognize from him. Things like healthy boundaries and not getting drawn into family dynamics. I'd known this man since he was born. I knew how he talked. These weren't his words. I asked him directly one Thursday in autumn. I said, "Cal, are we all right?" Long pause. Then, "Yeah, of course." "Why?" I said because it felt like we were disappearing from each other's lives, and I didn't understand why. He got quiet. Then he said Priya had mentioned that I was emotionally dependent on him, that she worried he felt obligated to maintain contact with me out of guilt rather than genuine desire, that I needed to build my own social life rather than leaning on my son. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after that call. The same kitchen where Callum had eaten breakfast for 18 years. I looked at the chair where he always sat, slightly pulled out from the table at an angle because he always pushed back slightly when he was eating. I thought about Carol. I thought about what she would have made of all this. She would have asked questions, I decided. She would have wanted to understand what was actually happening before drawing any conclusions. So I started paying attention, not in any dramatic way. I just started noticing things. When Callum did come to Wollongong, which by now was down to once every 2 months, he seemed careful, measured in a way he'd never been with me before. He'd glance at his phone frequently. Once, when I was in the middle of telling him about a bloke from work whose retirement had gone sideways, Callum got a text, and his whole demeanor changed. He became slightly distracted, slightly elsewhere. I asked if everything was okay. He said yes. Just Priya checking in. They'd been apart for 3 hours. My old mate Rodney noticed before I named it. Rodney's 67, former diesel mechanic. Sharpest person I've ever known for seeing through surfaces. We've been friends since we were 22. Met on a job in Port Kembla, over a beer at the Coromel Hotel one evening. I was explaining the situation, and Rodney listened without interrupting, which was how you knew he was taking something seriously. When I finished, he set down his glass and said, "Mate, that's not her having boundaries. That's her running his perimeter." I looked at him. "She's controlling who gets access to him," Rodney said. "She's not protecting herself from your calls. She's protecting her position from anyone who knew him before she did." I drove home thinking about that. Rodney wasn't the type to catastrophize. If anything, he tended to be the one who said, "Give it time. Settle down. It'll sort itself out." For him to say what he'd said meant he'd seen something real. The engagement announcement came by text. Not a call. A text. At 9:40 on a Tuesday morning. "We got engaged last night, celebrating with her family this weekend." A photo of them on what looked like a rooftop somewhere in the city, Sydney Harbor behind them, Priya's ring catching the light. Callum looked happy in the photo, genuinely happy, and that, more than anything, was what made the whole thing so hard to navigate. Because if someone is happy, you want to honor that, even when something underneath it doesn't sit right. I texted back, "Congratulations. I meant it." I called him that evening and left a message. He texted back, "Thanks. Talk soon." The engagement party was 6 weeks later, held at a venue in Surrey Hills. One of those converted warehouse spaces with exposed brick and pendant lighting and a bar that served cocktails with botanical names. About 60 guests. I knew approximately 4 of them. Callum met me near the entrance when I arrived, and I could see immediately that he was managing 2 things at once, being glad to see me and being anxious about something I couldn't quite identify. He introduced me to a few of Priya's colleagues. They were polite in that slightly performative way people are polite when they've been briefed to be polite. Priya came over about 10 minutes in. She was dressed beautifully, poised, and she greeted me with a hug that lasted exactly as long as it needed to, and no longer. She pulled a laminated card out of her jacket pocket and held it out to me with a bright smile. It was white, about the size of a business card, with clean black text. "Observers only, no speaking without permission." She laughed. A few people nearby laughed. Callum looked at his shoes. She said, "It's just a joke." Callum says, "You always Pequillum." Callum says, "You always have an opinion about everything." The room was watching. Not everyone, but enough. I could feel my brother-in-law Graham, Carol's younger brother, who'd driven up from the Illawarra for this, go very still beside me. I smiled. I said, "Noted." I put the card in my jacket pocket. Later that night, Priya made a toast. She talked about Callum beautifully, his drive, his warmth, his growth as a person since she'd met him. Then she said, "And to family, the family we choose." She looked directly at me when she said it. On the drive home, Graham said, "Warren, what was that?" I told him I wasn't entirely sure yet, but that I was paying attention. The thing about paying attention is that once you start, you can't stop. Over the following months, I watched a pattern I was already familiar with: accelerate. Callum stopped coming to Wollongong. I was told by text that the Sunday lunch tradition we'd had for years was too much of a time commitment given where they were in their lives. Christmas that year was spent with Priya's family in Brisbane. I was invited to a Boxing Day gathering at a restaurant in the city. 2 hours, start time 11 a.m., which would have meant me driving up early morning and back the same afternoon. I went. I sat at the far end of a long table. Priya's mother gave a speech. No one asked me to speak. By February, I hadn't had a real conversation with my son in 11 weeks. I started keeping notes. Not because I decided to do anything with them. It was more that writing things down helped me think clearly, helped me hold the line between what I actually knew and what I was inferring. I wrote dates. What was said. What was not said. I wrote down the things Callum repeated to me that sounded like they'd been fed to him. Things like, "Dad, I think you struggle to accept that I have a partner now." And "Dad, healthy families don't require this level of contact." We were talking about a Thursday phone call. Graham called me in March, and his voice had that particular edge it got when he was trying to be careful with bad news. He said he'd run into one of Callum's old school friends, a bloke called Stuart, at a hardware store in Thirroul. Stuart had mentioned that Callum had reached out to him a few months earlier, out of the blue, to tell him that my behavior had been increasingly erratic since Carol died, and that Stuart might find me reaching out in unhealthy ways. Graham had known Stuart for 20 years. He told me all this and then went quiet. I sat with that for a long time. My son had been telling people who knew me, that I was erratic, that I was not quite right. I thought about the number of times Callum had mentioned, over the past year, that he was worried about my mental health. That grief had affected me more than I was willing to admit. That I'd become too needy. I thought about how those conversations had made me feel ashamed, uncertain, second-guessing my own reactions. Whether I was being too much, whether I was making it worse. That's the thing about having your character quietly undermined by your own child. It doesn't feel like an attack. It feels like a concern. And by the time you realize the concern is a weapon, you've already internalized half of it. I rang my GP, not because I thought I was erratic, but because I wanted to be sure. Dr. Fielding has known me for 12 years. I told her everything. She listened without notes, the way she does when she's actually thinking rather than documenting. At the end, she said, "Warren, I've known you through Carol's illness and death. You are one of the most grounded people I see. What you're describing is not a mental health concern. What you're describing is someone deliberately damaging your reputation with the people in your son's life." She used a word I'd heard, but never applied to my own situation. Coercive control. I went home and I started researching. Not because I needed to build a legal case, I was just trying to understand what I was dealing with. What I found was uncomfortably familiar. The isolation from family, the rewriting of history, the gradual erosion of the target's confidence in their own perceptions. The way the controlling partner inserts themselves as the only reliable interpreter of reality. And the way the person being controlled often becomes an unwitting participant in the isolation of the people they love, not out of malice, but out of conditioning. Callum wasn't cruel. He was conditioned. That distinction mattered to me enormously. In April, a colleague of Priya's found me on LinkedIn. Her name was Bridget. She'd left the firm where Priya worked about 8 months earlier. Her message was short. I know this might seem strange, but I've been thinking about reaching out for a while. I was friends with your son's fiancée for about 3 years. If you have concerns, you're probably not imagining them. I'd be happy to talk if that's helpful. We met at a cafe in Helensburgh, halfway between where she lived and where I did. She was in her mid-30s, direct, clearly nervous about having reached out. She told me she'd been close to Priya before things had ended badly between them. What she described was a pattern. At least 2 other men in Priya's romantic history where the same thing had played out: the gradual elimination of outside relationships, the reframing of existing family as toxic or unstable, the engineering of financial and emotional dependence. One of the men, she said, had ended up estranged from both his adult children and had lost his business because she'd convinced him his partners were defrauding him. By the time it unraveled, he'd lost 3 years and most of his savings. He now worked as a courier in his 50s. Bridget had stayed in loose contact with him. He'd told her that by the end, he genuinely hadn't been able to tell what was real and what Priya had constructed. He'd been so thoroughly separated from everyone who'd known him before her. I asked Bridget why she hadn't said something sooner. She looked at the table. Because the one time I tried to warn someone, she told everyone I was unstable and jealous. I lost my job. I lost mutual friends. I had to move. She looked up. I'm only talking to you now because I think you're further along than the others were at this point. And because I don't know. I think you're the kind of person who won't let it go. I hope I'm right. I drove home thinking about Callum, about whether I was already too late, about how you reach someone who has been taught to interpret your concern as manipulation. And then I thought about what I actually had. Because the thing about paying attention is that it accumulates. My notes, Bridget's account, which she was willing to put in writing, a series of text messages from Callum that, taken together, traced the exact progression Bridget had described, and one other thing, something I hadn't known what to do with until now. 3 months earlier, I'd been at Callum's apartment helping him fix a kitchen tap. He'd asked me to come up, one of the last times he'd initiated contact, and I'd arrived early while he was still in the shower. Priya had been at work. I'd noticed his laptop was open on the kitchen bench, and on the screen was an email thread I hadn't meant to read. But the subject line had caught my eye because it contained my name. I hadn't read the email. I'd looked away immediately and gone to wait on the balcony. But I'd seen enough to know that the thread existed, that it was addressed to someone I didn't recognize, and that the subject line read, Warren. Update on progress. Progress. I'd been a project. I hadn't known what to do with that at the time. I'd filed it away and tried to believe there was an innocent explanation. There wasn't. The wedding date was announced in May. September, Hunter Valley. I received a formal invitation in the post, which was the first piece of post I'd received from my son in 3 years. The seating chart, which I found on an online registry website Priya had created for guests to RSVP and view arrangements, placed me at a table with people I'd never met. 3 of Priya's elderly relatives from interstate, and 2 couples listed only by first names. I was the only person at that table connected to the groom. The table was listed as Table 12. There were 12 tables. I was at the furthest possible table from my son at my son's own wedding. I looked at that seating chart for a long time. Then I closed the laptop and went for a walk along the beach at Austinmer, the same walk Callum and I used to do on Sunday afternoons. The sea was that particular gray-green it goes in autumn. A bloke was flying a kite with his kid. I watched them for a while. I thought about Carol. About what she would have done. She wouldn't have made a scene. She wasn't that kind of person. But she also wouldn't have sat at table 12 with her hands folded, watching her son be consumed by someone who saw him as an instrument. Carol had a word for people who mistook patience for passivity. She called it their first mistake. I went home and I made some calls. The first was to Bridget. The second was to Graham. The third was to a woman named Elspeth, who ran a support group in Wollongong for families affected by coercive control. I'd found the group through my GP's referral and had been attending monthly for about 2 months by then. Elspeth had background in family law and had navigated situations like this before. She listened to what I was planning, asked careful questions, and said 2 things that I've thought about many times since. She said, "Make sure what you present is undeniable, not dramatic. Undeniable. And your goal is your son, not her destruction. Keep those separate." The venue was a boutique winery in the Hunter Valley sandstone buildings. Rolling vines. Exactly the kind of place that costs a fortune and looks effortless. Callum had rung me the week before, a rare initiated call, and his voice had had that managed quality that broke my heart a little every time I heard it. He told me he was looking forward to seeing me there, that it was going to be a beautiful day. He sounded like he was reading from something. I arrived in the afternoon. Graham picked me up at the accommodation we'd booked rooms at a place down the road. He was quiet in the car. He'd seen the seating chart. I found my table. Table 12. Priya's aunt was already seated, a small woman in her 70s named Norma. Wait, I checked myself. A woman named Dorothy. Dorothy was perfectly pleasant and slightly confused about why she'd been seated with the groom's father. I was pleasant back. Before the ceremony began, Priya made a point of crossing the room to where I was standing near the door. She was radiant in the way people are when everything is going exactly to plan. She patted my arm and said, in a tone designed to carry, "Warren, I hope you're feeling included today. I know big events can be overwhelming at your stage of life." I looked at her. I said, "Thank you for having me." And I touched the USB drive in my jacket pocket. The ceremony was beautiful. Whatever else was true, Callum looked at Priya with complete love. That was real. That was not constructed. And it made everything I was about to do both necessary and devastating. Because I was not trying to take that from him. I was trying to make sure he knew what he was standing inside of, so he could choose with his eyes open. The reception began. Speeches from Priya's father, her best friend, a colleague. When the MC asked if the groom's family would like to say a few words, there was a pause. I found out later that Callum had been told by Priya that I'd declined to give a speech. I had not been asked. He looked across the room at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since he was a teenager and thought I'd missed one of his school events. Confusion. And something that might have been relief underneath it. I stood up. I said that I had a short presentation I'd like to share, something I thought the people in this room should know about the journey that had brought us all here. Priya's face shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. The venue had a screen and projector set up for a slideshow of photos. I'd spoken to the audio-visual coordinator that morning, told him I had a special tribute from the groom's side, something a bit different. He'd been helpful and professional. I connected the USB. The first thing on the screen was a photograph. Not of the wedding, not of Callum and Priya. It was a screenshot of the email thread I'd seen on his laptop 3 months earlier. I hadn't read it that day, but Bridget had. Because the email had been sent to Bridget's personal address, the update on progress email had been Priya updating a third party about her strategy for isolating Callum from his family. Bridget had forwarded it to me 2 weeks ago. She'd been sitting on it for months, not sure what to do. The email was clinical. It referred to me as the father situation. It outlined a timeline. It noted that the Thursday calls have been successfully moved to every 3 weeks, and that resistance from the Wollongong contingent is manageable. It talked about financial consolidation, a plan, already in motion, to move Callum's superannuation into a joint account structure that Priya would manage. It referred to a previous partner, by first name the man Bridget had told me about, the one now working as a courier, as a successful outcome. Callum was standing very still near the bridal table. I pressed play on the audio. It was a phone call, recorded 8 weeks earlier by Bridget, who Priya had contacted to offer what she'd framed as an olive branch after their falling out. In the call, Priya had been relaxed, confident, clearly not expecting Bridget to have kept the recording. She talked about Callum the way you might talk about a renovation project, what was still to do, what was nearly finished. She mentioned my mental fragility as something she'd been building the narrative around for a while now. She mentioned, almost in passing, that once the super was transferred, she'd have options. The room was completely silent. Callum said, very quietly, "Turn it off." I turned it off. Priya was already speaking. Her voice was steady, controlled, impressive under the circumstances. She said I had fabricated everything, that Bridget had a vendetta, that I was a grieving man who had never been able to accept his son's independence. She said it calmly, and she said it well. And I could see some of the room wavering, because she was convincing, and she had had years to prepare for a moment like this. Then Callum said, "Stop." He said it to her, not to me. He said it quietly, without raising his voice. And something in the way he said it made her stop. He stood there for a long moment. He looked at the screen, which still had the email visible. He looked at Priya. He said, "You told me he declined to give a speech." She started to say something. He said, "I want to see the email." I had printed copies. I had them in an envelope in my inside pocket. Graham took them around the room, one to Callum. One to Callum's solicitor, an old family friend named Douglas, who had driven up from Sydney specifically because I'd called him the week before and told him there were potential financial crimes to consider. Douglas had read the documents that morning over coffee and had made 3 phone calls before noon. Callum read the email. He read it a second time. He looked up at Priya with an expression that I recognized, because I'd worn it myself the first time I'd understood what had been happening. It was the expression of someone who has just felt the floor move. "How many before me?" he said. She didn't answer. Douglas, who had been sitting quietly at a table near the back, stood up. He said that he was aware of at least one other individual who had suffered significant financial loss in circumstances that bore strong resemblance to what was documented, and that he had already been in contact with the relevant authorities. He said this very quietly, very precisely, and sat back down. Priya looked around the room. Whatever calculation she was running, she must have known it wasn't going to land. She picked up her bag from the bridal table. She straightened her dress. She walked out of the reception hall through the main doors. And she did it with her head up. And I thought, not for the first time, that she was extraordinary in her own terrible way. The silence after she left lasted a long time. Callum sat down at the edge of the nearest table. His groomsmen stood around him uncertainly. His best friend, a bloke named Robbie who'd been at school with him, crouched down and just put a hand on his shoulder without saying anything. That small gesture, Robbie crouching there, not speaking, just present, made me feel something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized had been tightened for 2 years. I walked over. I stood in front of my son. I didn't know what to say, so I said, the only thing that was true. "I'm sorry it had to be here." He looked up at me. His eyes were wet. He said, "Dad, how long did you know?" I said, "Long enough to be sure before I did anything." He nodded slowly. Then he said, She told me so many things about you." His voice broke slightly. "Things that felt real, Dad. They felt real when she said them." "I know," I said. "That's what it's designed to do." He didn't say anything else. He reached out and held onto my arm the way he used to when he was small and had fallen over, not in pain exactly, but needing something solid. I just stood there and let him hold on. In the days that followed, the picture came together in ways that confirmed the worst of what Bridget had described. Douglas's inquiries, which quickly became a formal matter, revealed that Priya had already transferred a significant amount from the joint account she and Callum had opened 6 months earlier, $42,000, moved in small increments to an account in a name neither Douglas nor the investigators immediately recognized. The superannuation consolidation she'd outlined in the email had been attempted once already and knocked back by the fund's own fraud detection protocols. The man Bridget had told me about living in Brisbane now, working long hours, still rebuilding, provided a statutory declaration that detailed an almost identical pattern. Callum moved back to Wollongong for 2 months while everything was being sorted. He slept in his old room. We didn't talk about Carol as much as I expected. Mostly, we just re-established the ordinary rhythms. Breakfast, the news, a walk in the evening. He went back to see his GP. He started seeing a therapist, a woman who specialized in recovery from psychological coercion, which is what this was now being called in the official context. One night in October, he came out to the back veranda where I was sitting with a cup of tea, and he sat in the other chair, the one Carol used to sit in, and was quiet for a while, and then said, "I keep trying to find the moment where I should have seen it, and I can't find it." I told him that was the nature of it, that the people who do this are not clumsy or obvious. They are patient and skilled, and they understand exactly which instincts to exploit. The instinct to trust the person you love. The instinct to give the benefit of the doubt. The instinct to believe that concern for you is love, even when it isn't. I told him about gaslighting, the specific technique of making someone doubt their own perception until they need the gaslighter to interpret reality for them. I told him about coercive control, that it had only become a criminal offense in New South Wales in 2022, and that the law was still catching up to how it actually operated in people's lives. I told him about the research showing that financial abuse, the control of money as a tool of domination, was one of the most reliable indicators that other forms of abuse were present. He listened to all of it. Then he said, "She always made me feel like you were the problem." He said it not with bitterness, but with something more like bewilderment. The way you feel when a magic trick is explained, and you can't quite reconcile the before and after. I said, "I know. She was very good at it. So were the red flags there all along?" I thought about that honestly. "Some of them were there early," I said. "The way contact with me was framed as something that needed managing rather than something that was just part of your life. The way she positioned herself as the only person who truly understood you. The way any concern I raised got reframed as my problem, my neediness, my failure to cope. Those are patterns. But they're subtle patterns, and they were wrapped up in someone who was also genuinely making you happy. That's the trap." Callum's case became part of a broader investigation that I won't detail here because it's still ongoing. What I will say is that Douglas told me in November that what had been uncovered was substantial, and that Priya would likely face charges in at least 2 jurisdictions. By Christmas, Callum had moved back to his own place in Sydney. He came down to Wollongong for Christmas Day. Graham came. Robbie and his wife came. We ate too much and watched cricket and sat on the back veranda in the evening and talked until it was late. Callum fell asleep on the couch at about 11, the way he used to when he was a kid after big family days, and I covered him with the throw that Carol had knitted and sat in the armchair opposite and thought about everything. Rodney came by on Boxing Day. We sat at the kitchen table with beers, and he said, "Did it go all right?" And I said yes. He nodded and drank his beer, and that was enough. In February, Callum called me on a Thursday. Not because we'd arranged it, just because. We talked for an hour. He told me about a woman at his work he'd started having coffee with. Someone who seemed, as he put it, straightforwardly, herself. I said that was a good sign. He laughed. It was the real laugh, the one from when he was young. I hadn't heard it clearly in nearly 2 years. There are things I want to say to anyone who recognizes something in this story. Not lessons in the preachy sense. I don't have any interest in lecturing. Just things I've come to understand that I didn't know before. The first is that coercive control doesn't look like control from inside it. It looks like being loved by someone who is very invested in your well-being. The tools it uses: concern, protectiveness, the reframing of outside relationships as threats, are indistinguishable from genuine care until the pattern is visible. And the pattern takes time to become visible. If someone you love seems to be slowly disappearing from your life while telling you they're fine, pay attention to who they're disappearing toward. The second is that when someone is being manipulated, trying to tell them what's happening rarely works. Manipulation works by installing the manipulator as the only trusted source. So anything you say will be filtered through that lens and come out the other side looking like jealousy, control, instability. What works is accumulating truth and waiting for a moment when the truth has room to land. That's not passivity. It's strategy. The third is about asking for help. I waited too long. I was embarrassed to say out loud that my son was being used against me. Embarrassed in the way that men of my generation are embarrassed by anything that can't be fixed with a spanner. Doctor. Fielding's calm response to what I told her: not shock, not disbelief, not pity, just clear-eyed recognition, was one of the most useful things that happened to me in this whole period. There are people who understand this. Find them earlier than I did. And the last thing, the hardest one. Your child can be a victim, and also the instrument of harm to you at the same time. Holding both of those things is difficult. You want to be angry, and you have every right to be. But if you hold on to the anger at your child, you will lose the thing you're trying to save. Callum didn't do what he did because he stopped loving me. He did it because someone spent 2 years teaching him that loving me was a problem. The goal was always to get him back, not to make him pay for what she made him do. Keep those things separate. It matters more than you know. The card Priya handed me at the engagement party, observers only, no speaking without permission, is still in the drawer of my bedside table. I kept it because it's a useful reminder, a reminder of what someone thought I was, and what I turned out to be instead. I've thought a lot about what actually happened over those 2 years. Not the events themselves. Those are clear enough, but the mechanics underneath them, because what Priya did didn't happen by accident. It happened because she made calculated choices, consistently and patiently, over a long period of time. And what I did in response, paying attention, documenting, waiting for the right moment, those were choices too. The outcome wasn't luck. It was the natural consequence of 2 very different sets of decisions colliding. That's the thing about cause and effect that people sometimes miss. It's not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It just accumulates quietly until it has enough weight to tip the scale. Priya spent 2 years building something she thought was solid. What she didn't understand was that she was also building the evidence of what she'd built. Every text she had Callum send me, every story she planted in his ear, every person she quietly warned off, each one of those things left a trace. And traces add up. I don't think of myself as a particularly clever man. I'm a bloke from Wollongong who fixed roads for 30 years. But I do think I'm patient, and I think I understand that wisdom isn't about knowing everything in advance. It's about staying clear-headed enough to see what's actually in front of you, rather than what you wish was there. That's harder than it sounds. When Callum started repeating things to me that weren't true, things about my mental state, my neediness, my inability to let him live his own life, part of me wanted to believe him. Because he was my son, and I trusted him. And because if what he was saying was true, then the problem was fixable. I just needed to be better. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to understand that the fog I was feeling wasn't my grief making me erratic. It was someone else, deliberately generating the fog. Once I understood that, everything became simpler. Not easier, but simpler. I knew what I was dealing with and I knew what I had to do. The courage part, and I do think it takes courage, was being willing to act on what I knew, even when I couldn't be certain of the outcome. I didn't know if Callum would believe me. I didn't know if I'd lose him entirely. I only knew that doing nothing was a guaranteed loss, and that doing something gave us a chance. That's not bravery in any grand sense. It's just arithmetic. What I want to say to anyone sitting in a similar place watching someone they love disappear toward a person who doesn't deserve them is this: trust what you observe over time more than what you're told in any single conversation. Manipulation works by controlling the narrative, by making each individual incident seem isolated and explicable. It's only when you step back and look at the pattern that the truth becomes undeniable. So step back. Write it down. Look at it with the same eyes you'd use if it were happening to someone else. You'll see it. And then, and this is the part I got wrong for too long, ask for help. Not because you can't handle it alone, but because isolation is exactly the tool being used against you. And the antidote to isolation is other people. Dr. Fielding, Rodney, Graham, Elspeth and her group, Bridget, who took a real risk to reach out. I didn't get Callum back by myself. I got him back because enough people who understood what was happening chose to stand alongside me rather than wait to see how it fell out. Callum is doing well now. That's the thing I come back to. He's doing well, and so are we. The damage was real, and some of it will take years to fully settle. But he's still my son, and I'm still his father. And Priya, whatever she tried to build with those 2 years of careful, patient work, didn't manage to change that. That's not a small thing. That's everything.